We're very fortunate today to have a guest speaker with us in Pat Ford. Pat was elected to the position of Federal TAFE Secretary of the Australian Education Union in January 2004 and as Deputy Federal Secretary in February of this year. Prior to this, Pat previously held the position of Federal TAFE President for 6 years and at the same time served as Vice President TAFE in the Victorian branch of the AEU. Pat has taught in Victorian TAFE colleges, at university and in schools. Pat is an advocate of the public TAFE system in Australia and a critic of the damaging effects of competition and marketisation. She is committed to maintaining and extending the status of the profession of TAFE teaching for all TAFE teachers, and it's my great pleasure today to welcome Pat to our conference.
Thanks, Gary. I think I've structured a presentation in such a way that I should be able to give you a really quick overview of what's happening to TAFE in Australia at the moment, and then take you into a preparation, I think, for the resolution, because not just in New South Wales but around Australia, what happens in the next 12 months is going to be critical. But I can tell you now that all eyes of Australian TAFE teachers will be on New South Wales in the next period of time, because the sort of campaigning that you're doing here around TAFE really is a bit of a benchmark for us around the country. I just want to take, as I say, what I want to do is just take you quickly through what's happening to TAFE in Australia. Australian governments have been trying to privatise TAFE for more than 25 years. This isn't a new thing, it's been going on for 25 years. Neoliberal bureaucrats and peak employer bodies control vet policy. In the late 1980s, John Dawkins, the then Minister for Employment, Education and Training, is credited with writing the National Training Reform Agenda. In fact, he was a key architect of the National Training Reform Agenda, and we'll have a little bit of a return to John Dawkins towards the end of the presentation. Recent policies, the opening up of all government vet funding to competition, the rapid expansion of for-profit colleges, and the complete shift of costs from governments and employers onto students is the logical point, the logical end point of a reform process which started with the National Training Reform Agenda 25 or 30 years ago. These are I've got three key statistics to show you around the country comparatively, and in many respects these are the key things which show you what's going on to public vocational education through TAFE at the moment. Nationally, in 2008, more than $1 billion worth of government recurrent funding, or around about 21% of the total overall budget, was allocated contestably. Just to show you how the reform process and the competition process has accelerated over the last few years, by 2012, almost double that amount of recurrent funding was being allocated contestably. That's $2.56 billion of your money that was being allocated contestably, largely to private providers across Australia. In Victoria, which is the state government where the reform process started earliest and where the reforms are most advanced, in 2008, $2.69 million, or 22%, much like the national figure, was being allocated contestably. Yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, fantastic. Much better. Thank you very much, Jenny. By 2012, 1.3 million, that's billion, sorry, or 71.31% of government recurrent funding was being allocated contestably. I'm sorry about that typo. It's $1.3 billion of government funding in 4 short years, or 71% of government recurrent funding is now being allocated contestably in Victoria. In South Australia, and I've only chosen two figures for South Australia, the 2011 and 2012 figures, and that's because in 2012, for 6 months, the government's Skills for All, or their reform process was commenced, and in 6 short months in 2012, the amount of funding which was being allocated contestably in South Australia rose from 26% to 74% in 6 months. That is the process of skills reform rolling out in South Australia, and can I just assure you that Skills for All in South Australia is smart and skilled in New South Wales. In New South Wales, so that you do have a bit of a benchmark, in 2008, $298 million, or 18% of the recurrent budget, is being allocated contestably. In 2012, that's risen sharply, but at this stage in history, that is the benchmark that you're starting with, 20% of government recurrent funding allocated contestably. How much government funding is going to private providers around the country? And can I just make the point when I go through these figures, which I'll do as quickly as I can, in TAFE and VET, unlike in the schools sector, private colleges are for profit. They are allowed to be, and in fact, they all operate for profit. That means that their main purpose in operating is not the provision of vocational education and training. It is to get a profit for their shareholders, and I'll return to that theme a bit later on. In 2008, 11%, or $477 million, was allocated to private providers. By 2012, that had doubled, and $1.4 billion was going straight to private providers in Australia. In Victoria, as I say to you just very quickly, the benchmark reform state, 12%, or 137 in 2008 at the beginning of their reforms. By 2012, 40% or more of government funding in Victoria is going to private for-profit providers, and I'll return to that theme a little bit later on. Again, in South Australia, which is the second reform state, and again in a period I've just chosen from 2011 to 2012, 9.5% of funding in 2011, that a figure had doubled in 6 months. 6 months that had doubled in South Australia to 24 or almost 25%. In New South Wales, you are still operating at relatively low levels of the proportion of government funding going to private providers. That will change under Skills for All, under Smart and Skilled. So what's happened to VET and TAFE funding? In Australia, you can just see a year-on decline, a decline of 6.19% in the last year, almost 26% in the last 10 years. In Victoria, again, you can see that trend, an ongoing decline matches very much what's happening nationally. In South Australia, which is, again, I just remind you, the state that is most recent in its skills reform, it shows you, the reason I've chosen to show you South Australia because it shows you unequivocally that the process of competition and skills reform is absolutely linked with ripping public money out of the system. It's those two things which are combined. In New South Wales, again, you are poised on the brink of introduction of competition or formal introduction of competition. In the last 12 months, believe it or not, your decline was 0.84%. That figure will increase, there's just no question about that over the next period of time. Vocational education is the lowest funded of all education sectors in the country. That is not the politics of envy. All education sectors should be funded at a much higher rate. The story of funding in the VET sector for the last 20 or 30 years has been a process of just eating away and putting downward pressure on funding in the sector. Skills reform is smart and skilled, and what's it about? It's very, very simple. It's about government spending less on vocational education and training. It is crucially about making students pay more, and in some cases, all of the costs of their education. It's about giving complete control of courses and qualifications to employers, and it's about creating compliant workers who have access to a restricted and narrow set of instrumental skills for a job. The goal of Smart and Skilled and the national reforms is to make 100% of government recurrent funding allocated contestably, to reduce government funding by forcing students to pay for the full costs of their training, and it's about privatising TAFE. How do employers, and I'll do this really quickly, but the reason why I've introduced this little segment to you is because I want to show you the link between what happens in vocational education and training and what has happened over the last 20 years and the decimation, if you like, or the erosion of the control of the curriculum away from teachers. There's a mandated system of qualifications in the vet sector. They're called training packages. They're developed by industry skills councils. Training packages are narrowly designed for specific occupations, are fragmented and are based on industry, and that now means employer-derived competency standards. All public funding of funded course delivery in the vet system in Australia must be through training packages or industry-endorsed standards. Now just think about that. That is the only way in which public funding is now channeled into the public vet system. It's through training packages. How do they dominate the vet system? Only some unions are represented on industry skills councils, and only some, and an increasingly small number of unions, have any say over training packages. Teachers and educationalists are excluded from industry skills councils, and therefore they're excluded from the development of training packages. Training packages are the teacher-proofing of qualifications. This happened many years ago in the vet sector, and it is largely a large part of the damage that has been done to TAFE and to the public vocational education and training system over the last 20 years has been about an aggressive policy of separating teachers from the educational process in the sector. Training packages combine with the national entitlement to restrict access to public funding. This means no public funding will be attached to training packages unless there is a job outcome. Now just think about that. Just think about that. What governments are doing in the three other reforms in Queensland, Victoria and South Australia at the moment are narrowing the allocation of public funds to training, arguing that unless there is a job outcome at the end of that process, there will be no public funding attached to it. This is the argument about skills lists. This is the argument about skills shortages. No public funding will be available through the national entitlement except to the first Certificate 3 qualification. That's the first qualification. And then the second qualification is that it has to be in a narrowly defined skill shortage area. In other words, what is happening progressively, what's already happened in Victoria and is happening in Queensland and South Australia and starting to happen here, is that the only public funding that will be attached to qualifications is the first Certificate 3 qualification in a narrowly defined skill shortage area. This also means over time no public funding will be available for most qualifications above Certificate 3. This is already happening in Queensland and in Victoria and South Australia. Students will have to pay full fees for qualifications. A provider, a registered training organisation, can charge students as much as they want for a qualification. Fees are deregulated. There is no limit to what a provider can charge a student for a qualification. Students must then take out a loan to pay for the qualification, that's vet fee help, but at this stage loans are only available for diplomas, advanced diplomas and a few Certificate 3s. That is the very same model that they are proposing to introduce into the university sector. The deregulation of fees means you separate, what it basically means is you completely open up the market. In the higher education sector, it means that universities can charge what they want for qualifications. This has been going on in TAFE and VET for the last 12 or 18 months. Basically, a provider can charge whatever they want for a qualification, and then they can try and induce students into getting loans for some qualifications through VET fee help. The 2012 National Agreement for Skills and Workforce Development required all states to adopt voucher-like funding. In New South Wales, this is Smart and Skilled. It decouples funding from TAFE and attaches it to individual students. Individual students then go to a private college or a TAFE to use their voucher. Fewer and fewer qualifications, as I've explained, are receiving public funds. Funding for the voucher is continuing to be reduced. That's where it locks into that ongoing decline in public funding. It's about destroying provision of vocational education through public institutions. That's what this agenda is about. It's about destroying the provision of vocational education through public institutions. It's about destroying TAFE. The Victorian experience, and I'll just take you through it really quickly. 8 out of the 14 TAFEs and 3 of the 4 dual sector universities ran at a loss in 2013. There was a $216 million reduction in government funding following a $300 million cut in 2012. Swinburne University lost 56% of its government funding. Northern Met 47% of its government funding. Gipps, TAFE and Advanced, 2 small regional institutes, lost 45% of their government funding in 2013. Just imagine it. Just imagine it, after everything else that the Victorian TAFE system has been through over the last few years. Swinburne University lost 27% of its staff. They were on the upper end. Victoria University lost 23% of their staff. The dual sector universities in Victoria, who once accounted for 40% of public TAFE delivery in the metropolitan area, now account for only 8% of market share. TAFE's share of the VET market in Victoria has dropped from 70% in 2008 to 40% in 2014, and it's going down. Private provider share has grown from 14% in 2008 to more than 50% in 2014. How are the private colleges making money out of vocational education? There's no mandated duration of learning in VET. That is, because of the nature of CBT, competency-based training, it's argued that specifying or mandating an amount of time that students are required to undertake training for locks students into time service. No good. An anathema to CBT, they argue. Despite this, RTOs are still funded on an hourly basis. This is how dodgy private RTOs have been able to deliver diplomas over a weekend. They're not required to deliver a set number of hours, only enough hours to enable a student to be competent. And no one checks. No one checks. There are no checks and balances in this system. There are no mechanisms to check whether a student is competent. Theoretically, RTOs, private providers, theoretically, who deliver qualifications over a weekend are not doing anything wrong under this system. And let's have a very quick look at vocation. Vocation was listed publicly on the stock exchange in November last year, and it began trading in December. It was formed from 3 Victorian companies throughout the last year or so. Between 2011 and 2014, these 3 companies have increased revenue from $9 million to $119 million. Huge growth, rapid growth. They were tiny shopfront private providers in 2011. They just grew overnight. 81% of the revenue generated from vocation comes from Commonwealth and state Victorian governments. Most TAFE colleges would dream of having that much public funding. Vocation has more than 81% of its whole budget derived from public funds. John Dawkins, we've returned to John Dawkins. He's the non-executive chairman of Vocation. He was until recently the chair of two of the most important standard-setting and policy-making councils in the Australian vet landscape. National Skills Standards Council, it sets the standards for the sector, or did, it's been abolished. And the Australian Qualifications Framework Council, it looked after qualifications, it's also been abolished. On the completion of the offer, Dawkins was paid $1.2 million by the company that he helped establish. He will receive $200,000 annual director's fee in the new Vocation, but we'll return to him. He, if you remember, oversighted the introduction of market reform of TAFE and VET in the late 1990s. Vocation and Victorian TAFE. And I'll just remind you of the figures that I've already been through. Victorian TAFEs reported a $212 million reduction in government funding between 2012 and 2013. The three principals of the companies that formed Vocation withdrew $225 million in profit when they listed on the stock exchange. They've continued to hold $150 million worth of the companies, but they withdraw on that public listing $225 million worth of clear profit. Hold that idea in your heads. In 2016, and I'm just moving towards the end now, John Dewey said, "There is a danger that vocational education will be interpreted in theory and practice as just trade education, as a means of securing technical efficiency in specialised future pursuits. Education would then become an instrument of perpetuating unchanged the existing order of society instead of operating as a means of its transformation." And I just want to now just finish off by saying we really do need a new narrative for TAFE, part of a confident reassertion of the role of public vocational education. It needs to reject the drive to see students as consumers of private goods and seekers of competitive advantage in a volatile and despondent job market in an increasingly complex and degraded world. Students are under pressure from all sides to buy into a crude, vocationalist, competitive marketplace. The current attack on TAFE is more than the story of the closure of buildings and the retrenchment of teachers who have dedicated their lives to the profession. It's the shutdown of a vision or an idea of public vocational education, a vision, I think, which most people probably share. It's the story of lost opportunities and aspirations for many young people in Australia, but it is overwhelmingly and crudely an attack on the working class. TAFE, like hospitals, the justice system, art galleries, museums, libraries, and like schools and universities, exist as public institutions. TAFE is complex because it's home to a multiplicity of missions, groups, and educational and social practices. TAFE does so many things. It helps form people as members of particular trades, as members of paraprofessional groups, and it enables people to gain entry into the professions. It is a home for adults to learn to read and write and for others to learn English. And it's this complexity that makes for its richness. This vision of the public institution of TAFE is not a matter of modern branding. It goes to the heart of how teachers see themselves and how they see students and vice versa. It is what is at its core a teacher's vocation. It is what it means when a tradesman says that he wants to become a trade teacher because he wants to give back, or what it means for English language teachers to share a moment's pride when finding out a former student is doing a university degree. It's when a panel-beating teacher says that he sees his job as helping students to start the course believing they don't have any brains and then discover through learning that they do. This is not feel-good stuff dissociated from the tough world of work. It's an ethos that so pervades the ordinary practices of the institution that, like the air we breathe, it's just taken for granted. It's this ethos that enables teachers to see students not just as they are at the moment, but how they can become as they work their way through courses, and to engage with how they are. It's also what enables students to see what they're doing as real stuff, because they're taught by experts from fields they want to enter. Lawyers turned law teachers teaching the foundations of criminal law, welfare professionals turned community service teachers discussing the issues of child abuse with prospective welfare workers. Nurses turned nursing educators and teachers teaching prospective nurses the signs of an imminent heart attack. TAFE teachers are just like school teachers. They teach students, not skills and not training packages. Governments and bureaucrats embarked on a campaign to destroy TAFE 20 years ago. They renamed it VET. They said competition and markets should control policy through employers. They said students should become consumers who exercise their choice over their provider and who should pay, and become indebted for the opportunity to access crude and debased skills for jobs. They targeted TAFE because they understood that TAFE would always be a repository of the hopes and dreams and aspirations of working class people. And that's because of TAFE teachers, and largely, comrades, I say to you today, it's largely because of the work of our union. Stop TAFE Cuts is about rebuilding and re-prosecuting the idea of TAFE as a public institution dealing with the public good. It's about celebrating the achievements of the public TAFE system, and all this must be part of building community, union and the broadest possible support for public TAFE institutions. Don't underestimate the scale of the attack on the TAFE system. In some states and territories, TAFE is not going to survive in its current form. I mean that seriously. I hate saying it, but I just need to say that to you as clearly as I possibly can. But it would be an indulgence for us to do anything but fight, and our job is to pass on the flame through the work we do in rebuilding the idea of public vocational education, not the ashes of the system the John Dawkins and the Chris Eccles of the world would have destroyed. Thank you.